Hi everyone, and welcome to our latest how-to webinar. I'm pleased to say I'm here joined by Stuart Harper today, and Stuart is going to talk to us all about how to use the techniques of risk management in your smaller business. So what I'll do is I'll hand over to Stuart in a minute to kind of introduce himself and go through what he's going to talk about. But if you do have questions as we go through, and there is the chat box, there is the Q&A box. I'll kind of keep an eye on that and kind of intervene with those questions. So I know Stuart's very keen to ask questions or comment as we go through. So please do as we go through, and we're more than happy to take those. If you want to leave it to the end, again, that's fine. It's entirely up to you, but feel free to jump in as we're going through. So there's nothing much more for me to say. I'll hand over to Stuart. So if you can kind of introduce yourself in the session, and looking forward to it.
Well, thanks very much, Michael. It's great to be with everybody this morning. Risk management, I think, is a topic that perhaps is seen as one for the corporates and not one for an SME. And it's my view that isn't true, and for a number of reasons I'll talk about. But whilst you might not want to apply the same mechanisms for recording, for example, the techniques, the principles of risk management are, in my view, absolutely crucial for a small business. So if technology allows me, there we go. Hopefully you can see my slides now. I can't claim to be presenting you with the most whiz-bang slides, but perhaps that's right for something like risk management. What I want to sort of talk about, first of all, is what risk is. And it's crucial because people often see it as a negative, and to an extent it is. The threat of a bad outcome is probably the best way of putting it, or the risk that you won't achieve what you're trying to achieve. But it's my view that actually it's more than that. It can be an opportunity. It can be an opportunity to think about what you do in your business, how you manage change, and the opportunities that come with that as well. There are others that will say you can't do anything about risk. Risk is there, business is risk, and to an extent they are right. All business is risk, and you should be embracing those risks. But you can do something about them. They aren't just going to come left field. Some will, and perhaps the last year has taught us that there will be significant challenges that come from left field that we weren't expecting. But you can do something about them. What I'm really wanting to get across is this: managing risk is not about being safe. It's not about just going down the safe option, just running the easy and risk-free path. It's all our business, all our work that we do carries risk. But if we manage it, we can utilize the opportunities too. So I want to start, first of all, by thinking about two of the most important questions. And to an extent, these are questions that others in the group are probably better qualified to answer than me. But I do want to think about the questions first. And I want you to have a think about what it is that you're trying to achieve. Now, macro goals, that's absolutely fine. But I'm talking about those objectives that are below the overall objective for the business. So what is it you're trying to achieve in the next 12, 24 and 36 months? Have you listed those down? Have you listed down what you want to do in that period of time? And that's the first thing I would suggest. List down your plan for the next 12 to 18 months. The outcomes being the crucial part of that equation, if you like. And it's only by listing those outcomes that you're trying to achieve that we can then start to talk about what it is that might derail you. And it's the derailing from those outcomes that is the risk. So if I'm trying to achieve growth of 20% over the next 12 months, say, and 30% on top of that in year 2 and 50% in year 3. What are the things that might derail me from doing that? Now, those will fall into all sorts of different categories. They might fall into the risk that there aren't customer demand is not there. They might fall into the risk that suppliers aren't able to provide me with what I need, and so on. But those things that might derail you, those are the risks to your business. And we'll talk about taking those myriad of risks into a more manageable form in a minute. But it's really, really important that you spend as much time as you can looking at those risks to your business. What is it?
Do you mind, Stuart? I'll just jump in there. No, it's a really good point, because it's something I've been doing myself recently, and that includes what I've basically done is kind of looked at what my plans are for the next 2 to 3 years, and then kind of broken down essentially the potential issues, like I said, risks to that kind of in the next couple of months, in the next year, and the next 3 years, and kind of breaking them down. And that's actually helped me develop that plan as we move forward, because you can build those things, or there's potential risk and issues into that plan. So now I definitely like to endorse that.
Well, that's great, Michael. Thank you, because you're absolutely right that those things are there that could derail you. But what I want to talk about as we move on is how you can plan for some of those. Now, there are risks in your plan, I suspect, that you can't do an awful lot about. But then it comes down, as we'll talk about in a minute, as to how much impact they will have on your business, and how much you need to be concerned about. If you can list the key risks that apply to your strategy, then we've got something we can start with. And I want to talk about the actions we can take in advance. That's the first thing that I really want to focus on. And these are what we would call control measures. So the control measures against any risk. So if you imagine now you've got a list of potentially 50 risks to the business. And I'm going to talk a bit later on about not worrying about all 50 and actually really worrying about 5. But I'll come back onto that later on. If you think about those risks, there will be things you can do to reduce the impact or the likelihood before that risk occurs. Let's talk about risk impact and risk likelihood for a minute. Risk impact is about how much that risk will derail you. Is that just going to be a minor move off of the path, or is that going to take you completely off the tracks and potentially have such a significant impact it would mean you can't really move forward at all? And the likelihood, is that just a possibility, or is that almost certain? And we'll talk a little bit later on about how focusing on those scores will help you to hone down on some of the key risks. But the control measures are the things that reduce the impact or the likelihood. I've talked here about reducing exposure, e.g. having a wider customer base will reduce your risk if a major customer goes elsewhere. We'd all like that wider customer base, but perhaps we aren't as aware as we should be of the risk of not doing so. The measures that reduce the possibility of a risk, maybe horizon scanning to make sure we understand our changing demands. So if you look at some of the key business failures over the last maybe 25, 30 years, Blockbuster Video often comes up as being a good example of that. I'd love to see their risk register and what they did around understanding the risks to their business, because clearly the risks to them was that customer demand changed, as it did, and it was changing for many, many months. I think the stat I heard was that Blockbuster's board went for something like 56 months watching their share of the market decline before they intervened. That might be a false stat. I don't know where I heard it from, but the point being that the demand changed so significantly from what they were previously offering that they weren't keeping on top, and they could have reduced that likelihood of being interrupted had they done so. And then I've talked already about the possibility now, having listed all these things, having looked at your control measures, that you've got 50 or 100 risks. You cannot focus on 100 risks. If you spent your time doing that, you would end up doing nothing but. You would constantly go back to those. And frankly, you'd be in a state of paralysis that would mean that your business just wouldn't be moving forward. So what we do with a risk management approach is assign a score of likelihood and a score of impact. Those scores, I quite like a 1 to 5 scoring matrix. So you end up with a 5 by 5 grid. Some people do a 3 by 3. There's an advantage to doing different things. There's an advantage even to doing 4 by 4. Doing 4 by 4 stops you being, as many do, just sticking everything in the middle. You have to make a decision. If you go with a grade of 4, you can't hit the midpoint. So assign a score of 1 to 5 to the likelihood of each risk occurring. From low, i.e. almost certainly won't happen, but is possible, right through to almost certainly will happen. And do the same for the impact on your business were it to occur. From something that would be a minor irritation to something that would ultimately derail the business. So a reputational risk could have an impact as high as 5, potentially, because it can have the effect of derailing your business so significantly that you go out of business. You've then left with a risk matrix, and you've got everything plotted. You can plot everything on a 5 by 5 grid. Now, what a lot of people then do is spend as much time focusing on those risks that are very likely to happen but won't actually have any impact as those that are very unlikely but would derail you, i.e. 5 by 1 is the same as 1 by 5. And I argue very strongly against that. It's very, very likely that the sun will come up tomorrow. The impact on the business is not particularly bad. But the likelihood of a reputational damage as a result of poor social media content, for example, or an inappropriate retweet or something like that, may have a much higher impact. It may be very unlikely because you've got controls in place, but it has a much higher impact. Focus, in my view, on those with the higher impact. Don't just do a blanket approach. And that's why when it comes to scoring, and I'm not going to talk too much about scoring today, but when it comes to scoring, I always do something that makes sure that the client's risks are focused very much on the high impact risks.
Stuart, on that type of thing, how important is that it's not just yourself that looks at these risks? You get other people, and even if it's just you in your business, whether, I don't know if you've got contacts, you've got some of your customers even, because I'll say a lot of this is your perception of the risks. So to get other people maybe with a bit more knowledge, in a certain, you mentioned social media as an example there. How important would it be to have someone who's got a bit more experience or knowledge in that area? And not
I think that's absolutely crucial. It's worth saying something now about how we should work with those risks and how we should monitor them. Because what we're left with when we get through this whole process is we're left with a risk register, and it doesn't matter what format it's written on. Frankly, I would rather people wrote it on the back of an envelope than didn't do it at all. But testing out those scores, testing out the likelihood and impact of those risks is a really, really crucial part of the process, because unless you do that, you can't test your perceptions and potentially your biases. You may perceive that you've got strong controls in place. Now, there is an idea of having gross and net scores. So a gross score before you put controls in place and a net score afterwards. I'm not hugely wedded to that one, frankly, because I think you spend too long looking at what theoretically might happen but won't, because you've got control measures in place. But what is important is that you test out the resilience of those control measures. So I gave the example, and you picked up on the example of social media. That's a really, really good one. So let's think about proactive social media. You may look at your business and say, well, actually, the risk that people won't know who we are is minimized because we have a good social media policy and a good social media strategy, I should say. Well, actually, how good is your social media strategy? And that's when talking to colleagues who have a better understanding of social media, as we've got in the Northern Affinity, some people with really, really honed and expert skills in those areas, talking to them and saying, well, look, this is my strategy. And you may find that your strategy isn't quite as good as you think it is. Well, it's all right, because I put at least one tweet out a week. That's not going to do the job. So you've hit, Michael, on a really, really important part of it, is test out your biases. Those come in particular around the control measures, because if you test them out in the controls, you can say, well, actually, maybe I don't have as strong a customer acquisition model as I thought I did. Maybe I don't have as good an understanding of customer satisfaction as I thought I did. And those that's where a group of people testing out your assumptions is crucial. Now, I'm not going to talk about this in particular today, but it's why I advocate very strongly that non-executives make a massive, massive difference to a board and to an organization, because no matter what the size, we all need somebody who's going to look at our business without the rose-tinted specs that perhaps we look at ourselves. Risk management is a massive, massive part of that. But if you can utilize your skills, perhaps, you know, doing this on a reciprocal arrangement with another trusted colleague who's got another business, and perhaps you can do the same for them. Just testing out those control measures, I think, is a very, very useful and important part of the process, because it means that we've all got the opportunity to test and challenge our biases. So we've talked already about having an understanding of all the risks in the business, and I talked previously about potentially 50 risks. I could easily say I've seen risk registers with way more than that, but that's fine. But you're not going to spend the time you need looking at all 50. And this is when it comes down to how much risk you can afford in your business. Now, the answers will be different depending on what business you're in. If you are a school, as I work with a lot of education clients, there are elements of what they do where they can afford to take risks. They can afford to take risks on some commercial things that they might do, because they have minimal financial outlay. They may work, they may not work. If they work, then great. If they don't, well, not a lot was lost. And providing you're not misusing public money, you know, that's absolutely fine. But when it comes down to safeguarding, as an example, our risk appetite is absolutely zero. We can't afford to take risks on safeguarding, as you would understand. So your risk appetite, how much risk you can afford, will be different for every business, and it will be different too for different parts of your business. And that's when it comes down to focusing on those risks outside of your appetite. So of our 50 risks, we need to look at the impact and the likelihood. We're then left with a score, and we're left with a score. Perhaps we've looked at a matrix that's 5 by 5, and we've made sure our scoring is focusing on those with the higher impact, not the higher likelihood. And then we need to say, right, actually, what is my appetite for risk? What is my ability to absorb that risk? And that might be for the business as a whole, or it might be for an element of the business. And we can do something about any of those that are outside the risk. We can do anything about all of them, but I think let's not worry about those that we can deal with. this is where mitigations come in. And our mitigations are about what we will do when that risk occurs in practice. So, for example, the example I've given here, if the business were to suffer a significant interruption, or as a result of fire or flood, what plans do you have in place? Now, those will be there will be some plans that are control measures. For example, well, I store all my data in the cloud, and we're a paperless office, and all I need is a laptop, and I can and I've got a spare one at home, so I can start working from home tomorrow. And aren't we all used now to that side of a control measure? But the actions that that we're talking about here are the ones that say, well, actually, what more would I do? I can't do it now, but what more would I do? For example, I've got plans to open another site. I've got I would switch all of my business from site A to site B. These are not about reducing the likelihood, but these are about saying, well, if that were to happen, this is what I would do. This is how I would pivot. So looking at some of the things we've talked about earlier on in the session, let's talk about customer acquisition. If we find that actually our customer base is declining as perhaps we had feared, what more can we do to look at repeat business? What more would we do to look at different strategies for customer acquisition that perhaps we don't want to do if we are carrying on as we normally are. So the mitigations are those things that we will do if the risk occurs in practice, and they come into what we call the 4 T's. These are 4 T's that you can adopt with absolutely anything in your risk register. You can either terminate them, you can stop doing the thing that causes risk. You can't always stop the risk, but there will be, maybe you've looked at something and says it presents too big a risk to me, I just can't deal with it, and I can't endorse it, I can't reduce it to an acceptable level, so therefore that element is going to be terminated. We can tolerate it, we can look for particularly those risks that are inside our risk appetite. We can say, look, there's a risk there, I know about it, I come back to it, I constantly assess it, but I'm going to tolerate it. We can treat it, we can do something to reduce the impact or the likelihood. That's treating the risk, or we can transfer it. Generally, that's about insuring against it. If you look at a lot of the sports events that were cancelled, those will be transferred risks because they have insured against those sorts of interruptions. They can't affect the pandemic, but they can transfer the risk to somebody else, and that's generally an insurance opportunity. But there's actually a 5th T, and that's to take advantage. So what I mean by that is we've talked already about, well, actually, if this risk occurred, then this is what I do. Well, maybe that's what you should be doing anyway. Maybe that widening of your customer base, maybe that widening of your product base is what you should be doing anyway. So you're taking advantage of the risk by identifying other things that you might do. It's crucial. We've got the risks in place. We've identified them. We know what we can do to control them. We know what we can do to mitigate them. But what's really, really important is that we constantly come back to them. The risk register is not a static document. Michael, you asked earlier about using it to test against other people and others' assumptions and your own assumptions. And that's a really, really important point, an important part of this process. But we also need to make sure that our assumptions on impact and likelihood haven't changed. For the key risks in the business, you need to be looking at them very regularly. For those risks that are inside the appetite, you need to go back to them on a less regular, but still quite often, because you need to be able to say, actually, is that still the case? Is it still unlikely? We might have said 6 to 9 months ago that the risks to events in September 2021, for example, the risks are very small. Well, I still think the risk to those events is small, but it's higher than it was perhaps 9 months ago. Or perhaps you consider it's lower than it was 9 months ago because the vaccine's coming. That's all around how you test your assumptions. There is no right or wrong answer. But the key point is, even with myself, I can argue both cases. So go back, look, review, and think again about different ways of doing it. What I've tried to stick away from today are some of the mechanisms. I've not talked too much about risk register templates because they are helpful, and for corporates, they're absolutely essential, because unless you've got a common way of recording it, then you're not going to get the engagement you need from your board. If you are just doing it on your own, although I would advocate that you work with somebody else to test your assumptions, it doesn't really matter. You can write it on the back of an envelope, as I say. What's most important is that you record it. I have now talked, I wasn't planning to, but I have talked about the regular review of the risks. Are you still focusing on the big five? Are you focusing on the things that are the most important, or are you doing what Blockbuster, as the example I gave earlier, were doing, and focusing on all the other risks in the business, but excluding the one thing that was creeping up behind them, and ultimately led to their business not being sustainable. I mentioned, but I haven't really talked about, the distinctions between a gross and V net, or total V residual, i.e. what is before and after your controls. That can be useful if you want to assess your effectiveness of those controls. If you are of the view that that your social media strategy, your plans are absolutely are right and are working, then you would see a reduction in your scores, in your risk scores, between total and residual, because your residual risk, your risk left after your controls are in place, would have gone down. How effective, though, are your controls? And that's when it comes down to personal bias. And finally, I've not talked really about action plans. Action plans, if you were doing a risk register, would be the final column of the narrative, which say, well, actually, these are the things. They're not things I'll do if the risk occurs. These are things I want to do to reduce the risk. So, for example, I want to work on a new sales strategy, but I haven't done it yet. So my action plan might be to engage with Pete Evans or others who can look at sales strategies with me. That might be a control measure in the future, my sales strategy, but for the minute I can't say it's a control measure because I don't have it in place. So that's an action plan. So that has been really a whistle-stop tour of risk management. I hope what I've demonstrated is that it's not just for the corporates, that it is applicable to every business. The most important takeaway is to say to you, go away, work out what it is you're trying to achieve, and then write down all the things that could derail you from that. Then start to think about what it is you will do to control those risks, what it is you will do to mitigate if they do occur, and then start focusing just on the big five. And then hopefully you can expand that as time goes on.
Thank you, Stuart. That's fantastic. That's really, and I know for myself, that's really helped me. If nothing else. No, I think that, like you said, I think there's that kind of perception that anything to do with risk is for bigger businesses than maybe some of us are at the moment. But that's certainly not the case. And if nothing else, if you start thinking about it now, it's going to be a lot easier in the future when you get there. So if anyone after watching this, they want to kind of get a hold of you and find out a bit more about risk and what you do, what's the best ways to do that?
Well, the best way probably is through LinkedIn, Stuart Harper, Cardno Management Services. or through the Northern Affinity page. My website's not yet live, but it will be going live hopefully quite soon. My contact details are on the Northern Affinity page, though. So I'm a proud partner of the Northern Affinity, and I'm great to be a part of it.
No, thank you, Stuart. And that's some fantastic information. So for the guys watching, I'll be putting this onto the Mighty Network platform as well later today. Stuart, I'll be adding it to your profile on our website as well, so people be able to see that. So yes, thank you so much. Thank you for everyone's attended as well. If anyone does have any questions, like I said, I'm sure Stuart will be happy to take them offline and answer those. And I do know a lot of people watch this kind of after the event, if you like. So again, you all know where Stuart is. So thank you again, guys. We're back next week with another how-to at the same time. But thank you very much for your time, Stuart. Really appreciate it.
It's great to be with you.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.